Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin McCourt. I am the president and CEO of Vancouver Foundation, and really pleased to welcome you to our third online annual update event. We'll spend some time today talking about our year in 2021, the highlights of the year, and hope to provide you with an engaging and informative session. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. First of all, the event is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording after the event, so you can keep notes or you can wait for the recording. And for those interested in live closed captioning accessibility, you can enable this feature by clicking on the live transcript button along the bottom of your screen. And we know that that is often quite helpful for people following along on events like this. We're also, so to start off, I'm going to pass it over immediately to my friend Dennis. Dennis is Tsleil-Waututh. He's a leader in our community. He's positioned himself as a leader in Indigenous development sector. He's Tsleil-Waututh's culture liaison for the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh development in the Jericho lands, and is on the board of directors of the VSO, and is a recipient of Business in Vancouver's 2021 Top 40 Under 40. So we're very pleased to have Dennis join us with the land acknowledgement. Dennis, over to you.
Osiam, Kevin. Each while misteo, heights up, CM. Meets up Quilum, Musqueam, Skohomish, Tsleil-Waututh, Tamoch, Wanak, Quanasqui, Talitsin at Tsleil-Waututh, Skohomish, Kwakwakiwak, Hawaiian misteo, Ait Quanasqueloins, Kwanziquitsnala. In translation, I said hello. Just kidding. I really wanted to greet everyone in a good way. I wanted to welcome each and every one virtually to the unceded traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Wanak is my ancestral name, and I come from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. But my blood lineage and kinship is strongly connected to the Squamish Nation, the Kwakwakiwak peoples, and Hawaiian peoples. And it always gives me good feelings in my heart to conduct proper protocol, even through the metasphere of being virtual. I can't wait for one day till we meet in person. My English name is Dennis Thomas. I'm an elected council member as well as a senior business development manager for economic development for my community. First and foremost, I just really like to thank Jessica and also Kevin with the Vancouver Foundation for the invitation to open up this event in the meaningful and proper way as we try and build the spirit of reconciliation, and also UNDRIP as well, that really highlights and brings an enhancement to social, cultural, economic well-being, ending Indigenous specific racism and discrimination in modern society with our self-determination, inherent right to self-government. I mentioned those themes because it's important for us, and especially for foundations like the Vancouver Foundation that really supports Indigenous entities and communities that are really trying to build their self-worth within the traditional territories of their own community. I often talk about our Indigenous laws. I'm wearing a nice vest that my grandma, my ta'a, made me. And on the left, you can see a cedar paddle. And sometimes when you think about our Indigenous laws, we think of the imperial laws, or what the government sort of suggests. And this transition that we're in right now, to really understand and listen and hear how Indigenous laws have lasted for thousands of years within our own community that really pertain to sustainability or self-determination. The cedar is made out of wood. The cedar comes from the land. That's how we respect the land. One of our laws is respecting the Tumith, the Ha Tumith sacred lands. We also have the salmon, which relates to the water. Anything in the water relates to our environmental stewardship laws, because we need to make sure that those resources are plentiful and that they're taken care of. And, I think with the amazing work that the Vancouver Foundation with the Indigenous procurement and the Indigenous portfolio that it is active on, I think that there are many opportunities for our Indigenous communities to benefit from the donations and the philosophies and the anthropology of the Vancouver Foundation. In conclusion, I just really like to set the tone with a nice song. The song speaks to those laws that I was just mentioning. They speak in the dance movements. When you listen to the double beat, the ladies are performing while the men are drumming, and the movements reflect to the sun to give thanks and gratitude to the power of the sun regenerating the land, regenerating through photosynthesis of growth, a sense of renewal for our land. It gives respect to the water, because that is where our great-grandmother was born, through the womb of the salt water. And then we give respect to the fire, because fire is heat. It also represents, in our village sites that we used to have, that was the transfer of knowledge time. We didn't have modern heaters. Our heat was a fire. When we huddled around a fire, that's when the sacred knowledge and ancestral wisdom that was passed down from my grandfather and grandmother to the grandchildren. That's that sacred knowledge time. And this dance, this song pays homage and respect to that. So this is called our nature song. Oh, OCM, everyone. Heights Apka, Heights Apka. I hope you all have a wonderful event. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I really appreciate your welcome, and I just wanted to say a few words beyond thanks to you. It's just why this work is important to Vancouver Foundation, and my own journey, I suppose I could say, started in 2013 when I joined the Vancouver Foundation, and one of the very first things that I participated in was the Walk for Reconciliation, which happened right outside our office on West Georgia, to be part of 50 to 70,000 people that were saying that reconciliation is important to them, had a profound impact on me and on Vancouver Foundation. And we've been working to incorporate those themes and ideas in our work ever since. And I particularly like the fact that we and many others are making land acknowledgement central to the way we open our meetings. One thing that we've also done, and I appreciate your reference to it, is we're kind of expanding the concept a bit to not just acknowledge the land, but acknowledge the knowledge that our Indigenous hosts hold. And that's something that has been also important in our grant making work, because many of our granting programs, environmental, social, cultural, are building upon the knowledge of Indigenous communities to address today's problems. So we acknowledge the land and thank you for your stewardship, but also acknowledge the ways of knowing and doing that you're sharing with us. So I really want to appreciate and acknowledge your contribution this morning. Thank you, Dennis.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you.
And as Dennis mentioned, he's meeting us virtually. We actually would like to do a little poll quickly. I think Mandy can throw a little poll up to ask people what you would prefer going forward, because we have, this is the third one we've done virtually. The great advantage of virtual attendance is we get more people show up. It's easier to join, but we're also keen to do some in-person meetings. So we'll throw up a little poll online where you can just answer quickly whether you're interested in staying virtual, going back, or live. So just click one or the other, what your preference is, and we'll have just a quick little touch base. We're going to do a few of these polls during the course of the event just to get a sense of some quick reactions from the audience about what you're hearing or the kind of questions we're asking. So I thank you for having a quick mouse hand on the screen today. I'm going to take a few minutes now just to talk about 2021. And it was really quite an extraordinary year. And I've often said, I like Vancouver Foundation to be known for what it does, not for what it has. And 2021 was a year of doing. And a couple of things I would just note: new funds created. We had 88 new funds created, bringing us to over 2,214 funds. 21 new legacy donors were added, which brings us to over 800. And the combined effort of British Columbians meant that we raised a record $80 million in contributions in 2021, which is a record. And what was incredible is that was 33% above 2020, which was also a record year. So again, my thanks and gratitude to the generosity of British Columbians through Vancouver Foundation. But also in terms of doing, we worked with you to raise many funds, but we also granted an extraordinary amount during 2021, a very high $80 million in contributions to charitable programs across the province, which brings our total giving since 1943 to over $1.5 billion, which is a truly extraordinary number. And also what I have noted is that 500 million of that has been within the last decade. So the foundation has almost 80 years now, but is accelerating every year in terms of what we're able to contribute to the priorities of our province. And so beyond doing, raising money and granting money, there's some themes that underlie that work and that drive that work. And you've heard and in our conversation with Dennis, how Indigenous priorities drive our work. You'll hear more about that from Jessica Slater, our colleague, later today. And we significant response to the floods in November of 2021, continue to support charities as they recover from COVID and serve communities through COVID. But one of the ways that we've always appreciated the way that our donors work is that many of our donors work on the basis of trust. That you have a charity that you love, you know what they do, and you trust them. And in your annual contributions, they're given to the charity, and the charity is able to use that money to the way that they see is most suitable for their mandate. That is now being referred to by many people as trust-based philanthropy, builds on deep traditions of understanding that charities on the front lines know what the needs are, have governance structures and staffing structures and volunteer structures that enable them to deliver their work in an efficient and meaningful way. And increasingly, donors are building on that and giving grants with less specificity, multi-year grants, and really encouraging and trusting charities to do their work. And we're full supporters of that. We believe that many of donors, they express a high degree of trust in us. We want to reflect that and run that through our whole system. So appreciate that theme. The next theme I want to touch on a bit more is the pandemic itself, and its effects continue to linger. We see many charities continue to deal with higher than normal demands on their services, whether it's food banks or shelters. We certainly see the opioid epidemic continuing. And we have done quite a bit of work with our partners. Vantage Point is an example. Imagine Canada is another, on research and advocacy to let governments and others know that our sector is still struggling to effectively deal with the consequences of the pandemic. And as a general sense, the sector is doing more with less, but because fundraising has not always kept up. We've been very fortunate that our fundraising has been setting records, but most frontline charities are seeing a decline in their giving, receiving. So we're working to change that. We want charities to be able to do more with more. And that's been driving a lot of our advocacy. And one of the results of that has been a $30 million, historic $30 million contribution from the province of British Columbia to a COVID Recovery and Resilience Fund, which we'll be rolling out in partnership with the United Way in 2022, recognizing that the sector is still struggling to meet the demands that are placed upon it. So funding is important, and we're able to expand that. We've also been working on public policy, because charities in many instances are trying to deliver their work, but are often constrained by the public policy factors around that. Two examples that we have been working on to simplify the environment within charities work is on how charities can grant to non-charities. We recognize that there are many instances where organizations are they're nonprofits, they're community-based organizations, they're delivering valuable services, but they're not registered charities. It's possible for us to fund them, but it's very difficult and complicated, and in some ways quite paternalistic. And there's been a lot of work to try and change the system so that we can fund these community-based organizations on a more equitable basis. So we're seeing significant indications that government has listened at the federal level with some changes in the most recent budget. And locally, we've been working to change the Lobbyist Transparency Act, which governs how nonprofits and charities engage with the provincial government on issues of public policy. That act has in some ways put a bit of a chill on how some charities interact with government, and we think that it's important that charities are free and encouraged to engage with the government on public policy issues, not find that some unintended consequences of legislation are actually keeping their valuable voices out of the conversation. So that, lots of work happening in the foundation around in having charities with more resources and a regulatory environment that supports their work. But then I would also touch briefly on some of the underlying purpose. And as anyone who's been involved in philanthropy in the last couple of years will know, the questions around the pandemic, around inequality, around racism towards racialized populations and Indigenous populations has really challenged whether it's governments or private sector or charities to question, are we doing enough? Are we addressing, using our resources to address these effectively? We're deeply involved in these conversations. Some examples of work that we've done you can find on our website. We made 5 commitments to addressing racial justice and followed that up with a blog post on the 33 things we've done so far. Our work on reconciliation is a significant part of how we're aligning our work to our purpose. And these movements, these conversations are shaping the future of philanthropy. And I would encourage you to check out our magazine for more stories on this. There's some interviews from some of our constituents that talk more about how the purpose of philanthropy is shifting in response to the events of the present. And I would just wrap up my section of this before I pass on to Jessica with a moment of gratitude. The Vancouver Foundation approaches its work with a sense of abundance and a sense of gratitude. We recognize that we're blessed as an organization with a tremendous staff, with volunteers that outnumber our staff by about 3 to 1, with hundreds, thousands of donors, with the agencies we work with, that we're part of a big system that is generating real positive change for British Columbians. And I'm just very thankful to have been part of that, part of this movement for the last 8 years. And just want to express my gratitude to everybody there's, I think, probably over 100 people on this call today. Just express my gratitude to each of every one of you personally, and all of those who have been unable to join us today. But again, I'll just wrap up there. We've got lots to get through today. I'm really looking forward to introducing you to Jessica Slater, who's our Director of Indigenous Priorities. Jessica was hired a few months ago and has had amazing results so far. So Jessica, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And before we start, we're just going to throw another little poll up on the screen. A few quick questions just for fun. First one, how many First Nations communities are there in BC? And also, what was guess the total value of grants that we got in our most recent granting called the Indigenous Priorities Granting Program? And I will share my screen. So thanks everyone for participating in that. To start off, I'd just like to introduce myself to you all. My name is Jessica Slater, and I'm the Director of Indigenous Priorities here at the Foundation. A lot of work went into preparing the Foundation before my arrival. And I'm just so pleased at the incredible team that I get to work with every day doing this important work. Wapaske Pisquamisto Nasigasan, Ochekwe Sipi Cree Nation, Treaty 5 Ochinia. My mom is from Fisher River Cree Nation, a part of Treaty 5 in Manitoba, about 2 hours north of Winnipeg. And my dad's first generation English settler. And I'm here on the unceded shared territories of the Katzie and Kwantlen people in what's now known as Maple Ridge, BC. And I came into this work as an artist. I was doing community-based artwork programs that gave community members a voice on critical issues. And that led me down the road to working in Indigenous-led systems change. And this is what really drew me to Vancouver Foundation. They actually funded this project, Skookum Lab, that was addressing the high rates of Indigenous child and youth poverty in Surrey. And I was able to bring those teachings from my homelands around the Star Blanket to collect data that we then evaluated and put into a story. And we were able to bring this story to policymakers and have community members share how poverty had impacted them. And I'm happy to say that this sort of systems change work is what I see is bringing long-lasting change for our communities. And we were able to create new policies to better support that community. And I'm so proud of the legacy of Vancouver Foundation and all of the systems change projects they have funded over the last few years. But let's back up. How do we do this work in the context of Indigenous communities? When seeking knowledge within the Indigenous worldview, our first step is to observe what we call protocol. And I'm sure you've heard of protocols here in the nations, the many nations here in BC. But in Cree, our word for protocol is kia tisikoin. Sorry, kia tisikoin. It gets me every time. But it means the act of showing respect. And this step is critical in terms of being in right relations with Indigenous folks and going on our journey of reconciliation. And one of my favorite scholars, Patty Laboucaine Benson, describes this when she says, in our interconnected worldview, it is the acknowledgement that all learning occurs in the context of relationship. And I'm very pleased that we are moving to a more relational way of granting, because in the Star Blanket teachings, each one of those diamonds represents us personally, and that each and every one of us play a role in this work, no matter how big or small we are. And for our communities to be healthy, vibrant, and livable, it's dependent on everyone's gift flourishing. And we have all unfortunately heard the stories about how our gifts were not able to flourish. And I could tell you stories from my own family that would make your jaw drop about the history of residential school and how it's continued to impact our family today. And these impacts are still felt in our communities in how we're disproportionately impacted by things like the opioid crisis, COVID-19, Today is the National Day of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, and that has impacted pretty much every family I've come across in this work. We're losing elders at an incredible rate, and they are our libraries. They hold incredible wealth that needs to be transmitted to the next generation. And I'm very proud to say that Vancouver Foundation was one of the first signees of the Philanthropic Community's Declaration of Action. And this gives our sector a roadmap on how to be in right relations with each other and ensure that every Canadian has a chance to thrive equally. And, you know, one day I was sitting with my uncle, his name is Chief Crate, he's here in the center, because I was asking him, Uncle, I want to do something to help. And I was originally thinking of being a counselor, and he said, my niece, if you really want to make change for our communities, don't go into social work. He said, go into business. And it was a really weird concept at the time because I'm an artist going into business. But I started to see how his way of bringing business and innovation to our community was transformative. And it was essential for our community to be economically autonomous and powerful in our own right, which leads me to the work here at the foundation. I'm really proud of the work we've done over the last year. I was given a budget of $750,000 to grant in October of last year. And we were really intentional of how we reached out to rural and remote communities. And we thought we would get about, 40 to 80 applications, and we ended up getting 260 with a total ask of $11 million. And our jaws dropped. We didn't know what we were going to do. We came back to the foundation, and donor services, leadership, the board, as well as GCI was able to come up with $7 million to grant to Indigenous-led work across the province to meet a large majority of the need. And how did we do this? We've recruited an incredible Indigenous Priorities Advisory Council from many different sectors, representing different intersectional identities that help to bring transparency and accountability to all of our processes in Indigenous priorities. And one member in particular, Donna Robbins, she actually just had an elementary school named after her in Langley. She says, we're all from many nations paddling together in Yayastal, with one heart and one mind. And that really hit me because we are on this journey together, and it just made the work so powerful. So next steps, the biggest thing I'd like to highlight is moving into Indigenous-led systems change. We know Indigenous folks are innovators. We have much brilliance and ingenuity in our communities to solve these complex social issues. So we'll be running a co-design and learning cohort in the fall with systems change experts and Indigenous leaders across the province to co-develop our granting for 2023. And one of the ways we're doing this is in partnerships with communities. This is Hereditary Chief Frank Brown, who's bringing his exhibit Sacred Journey to Science World on July 15th. And I would like to extend an invitation to all donors here today, all participants, to witness some of the ways that we're partnering in community and bringing voice to the important ingenuity that's occurring in our communities. And Frank has actually been integral in introducing programs that around conservation that also give his members in Bella Bella university credits for going through the training program. So we're just seeing incredible work here across the province of BC. And like I said before, Indigenous folks have always been social innovators and systems changers. We always have worked in a holistic way. And next, I'd like to show you some short clips of a video that I did with two folks in particular, Diane Rusin and Jody Callahoo Stonehouse, who are sitting on our Indigenous-led Systems Change Advisory Board. And this was work that happened before my time here at the foundation, but I do think it's very relevant to the message of what we're trying to do here. So enjoy.
To know the land is to know the people, and to know the land is to remember what we were responsible for. The origin story of trauma in our communities, it's so layered. The complexity around colonialism, around the Indian residential school, and the legacy and the residue, the intergenerational trauma, and it's complex, the ways in which we got into this problem. To be able to sit in this roundhouse, which has 9 sides for the 9 main clans in our community, and to look around and to see the ground that the ancestors walked on is still left uncovered. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful place to be.
For way too long, we've had, even well-meaning organizations or people controlling our programs and our processes. And we have capable Indigenous folks that can do that work.
I think Indigenous people have very profound thinking, which is, in my mind, very straightforward. We know how to be naturally sustainable. We know how to be in relationship with all my relations.
And so social innovation can be a tool that we can use in communities to talk about the words that have meanings for our families, so we can bring those back so that we can love together, live together, be in relation together, and live that good life together. Social innovation is a way to plant seeds of hope. And in those processes, it's really important that we...
Oh, we lost sound. I'm sorry.
It's not easy creating a safe container, but we all have to agree when it's safe, we can actually start to look at the ugliness together, to heal it, to move forward.
It's really important that when we are in community and Indigenous community, that it needs to be led by Indigenous folks. And we need to be making that space. And if there's not enough practitioners, then we need to be building that capacity.
So as funders, it's time to take a risk and provide opportunities for Indigenous folks to do the work that we need to do internally, so we can start to heal those wounds so that we can be healthy and thriving communities.
It all goes back to identity. Do I know who I am? Do I know where I'm from?
And she says, and do I know where I'm going? Sorry, my internet is a little spotty. But thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to building relationships with our donors as well. And I hope to see you on the 15th and join us in this work to uplift the ingenuity, the brilliance, and the innovation that exists in Indigenous communities across BC. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to hand it over to David, that's going to cover our investment portion of today's presentation. Oh, and one more thing, are the poll results. Good job, everyone. The correct answer was 198 for Indigenous communities. And like I said in my presentation, we had $11 million in applications.
Thanks very much for that great presentation, Jessica. I've had the pleasure of chairing the investment committee of the Vancouver Foundation for the past 5 years. I'm excited to announce that Dawn Gia has agreed, in addition to her board responsibilities, to chair the investment committee going forward. Dawn is the president and CEO of the UBC Investment Management Trust. Prior to her current role, Dawn was a senior portfolio manager of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. She also serves on the investment committee of the Ontario Hospitals Association. Also, I'm happy to report that Kelly Woodall has agreed to join the board of the Vancouver Foundation, and become vice chair of the investment committee. Kelly joined the committee in 2017 and is a managing partner of Seymour Investment Management with an extensive background in equity research and portfolio management. I feel confident that Dawn and Kelly will do a fantastic job going forward. We also added one new member to our committee this year. Allison Gould is currently the Chief Investment Officer of the Saskatchewan Teachers Pension Plan and is responsible for managing over $6 billion. She has an extensive background in investment management and is ideally suited to be part of our committee. Unfortunately, two members reached their term limits last year. So two very familiar faces on this screen in the past, Tom Bradley and Rob Henkel, have done an absolutely amazing job with the Vancouver Foundation over many, many years, and they will be truly missed. In addition to Tom, Rob, Dawn, and Kelly, I've been very fortunate to have the expertise of Lisa Pankratz, Rob Edel, and Sabrina Liak. Thank you for your hard work and dedication. I would also like to recognize the fantastic work done by Eugene Lee, Adrian Cartano, and Bonnie Wong. They're a very special team that is passionate about what they do for the Vancouver Foundation. Now I'd like to pass the presentation over to Dawn.
Thank you, David. Thanks to Vancouver Foundation for having me. My goal today is to provide a general overview of what happened in the capital markets last year to set the backdrop for Eugene to discuss our fund performance. I will also touch on what the investment committee is working on in the coming year. These four charts provide a big picture view of various elements of the capital markets. The top left is for the equity market. As you can see, equity market went up strongly in Q1 2021, over 35% up compared to Q1 2020. Then weakened gradually throughout the year, but still at an elevated level of above 20% for any 12-month period return. It is not until the end of 2021 that the market started turning and has performed negatively in Q1 2022. The bottom left is for the bond market. Not surprisingly, bond return became negative during 2021 because bond yield started creeping up after we all started getting vaccine shots and people held strong hope of back to normalcy shortly. What was driving bond yield up is, of course, the inflation. In the top right chart, you can see that inflation had been tamed at around 1 to 2% level for around 10 years before it suddenly shot up in 2021. The most recent CPI reading of 6.7% is the highest since January 1991. Eugene will speak about factors contributing to the inflation situation. The market is expecting central banks to raise interest rates aggressively. My biggest fear is policymakers won't get everything right because the high inflation is not just from low interest rate. It is also from geopolitical tensions and supply chain disruption. However, the policymaker can't do anything on those. The only tools they have are interest rate and money supply. I fear that they will tighten policy until we hit a recession, yet inflation is still high because other driving factors are still there. Then we will be faced with stagflation, a scenario that more and more people are starting to worry about. That's why we keep on warning investors about future returns, because we are stepping into a regime that bond yield goes up and thus return goes down, and high rate will also drive down equity returns, as you can see in today's market. So the next 3 to 5 years will be very difficult for investment returns. The bottom right chart is for Canadian dollar. When the line goes down, Canadian dollar is appreciating. And when it goes up, Canadian dollar is depreciating. As you can see, Canadian dollar depreciated slightly in the second half of last year, which is beneficial to a Canadian investor like us because our global investment would have delivered higher return in Canadian dollar term. Next page, please. Speaking about inflation, in the current market environment, one question people often ask is, what assets provide better inflation hedge? This chart shows the correlation between various assets and inflation in different market environments. We can see that some asset classes exhibit more persistent correlation with CPI. In this chart, real assets and commodities would be better inflation hedges. Next page. The investment committee is working on an asset mix study for the Vancouver Foundation Endowment Fund. In an asset mix study, we normally focus more on longer term, 20 to 30-year return, which is more stable, as you can see in the chart. But we will keep various market scenarios in mind and strive to construct a portfolio that will weather better in all market conditions. With that, I will pass on to Eugene to go through some details on fund return and distribution quota.
Thanks, Dawn, and good morning, everyone. I'm Eugene Lee. I'm the Vice President of Investments at Vancouver Foundation. And first of all, a big thank you to you, Dawn, for agreeing to step into the Investment Committee Chair role. I've just added you onto my speed dial. Actually, that probably doesn't exist anymore in the world of Zoom. But I do very much look forward to working closely with you over the next couple of years. I also like to take this opportunity to thank David Christopher for chairing the committee since 2017, and Tom Bradley and Rob Henkel for spending over 10 years volunteering on the investment committee. So that is a very long time on any committee, and we would not have achieved the success and the stability without dedicated volunteers such as yourself. So my sincere gratitude to all of you. If you joined us last year, you may remember that we started this presentation with a word cloud reflecting on some of the themes that were top of mind as we navigated another year of the pandemic. Taking on a similar theme this year, I found this following survey that was conducted by the global consulting firm McKinsey & Company. This economic conditions outlook survey was conducted at the end of 2021, and it basically looked at what corporate executives in different regions around the world think will be the largest risk to global growth over the next 12 months. It probably isn't surprising if you look on the left-hand side that regardless of where you're living in the world, COVID and inflation were identified as the two biggest risks. What was also intriguing, I thought, was that supply chain disruptions and labor shortages, number 3 and 4 on this list, was clearly not felt the same way in all geographies. And at the very bottom of the list was geopolitical instability. And if we fast forward to today, would likely rise to the very top as one of the biggest risks to global growth over the next 12 months. So on that backdrop, this next slide is reiterating some of the numbers which you've already heard from Dawn. Markets were exceptionally strong in 2021, even by historical standards. Toward the end of last year, there was a lot of optimism around economic growth. The end of the pandemic was in sight, but also a bit of nervousness started to creep in around inflation and the expectation of higher central bank interest rates. One thing to note about the markets last year was that it was an incredibly, what we call a narrow market. If you didn't buy the Amazons and the Netflix and some of the high-flying tech stocks, you actually would not have participated in a lot of those gains, especially in the US markets. So worries about inflation have unfortunately become very real, and that's reflected in the market weakness so far this year. These numbers only go to the end of March, but I think things have actually gone down even a little bit more since then. The US market is down about 9% in the last numbers that I've checked to yesterday. So we're seeing equities pull back from their highs. Bonds have posted very negative returns as central banks continue to on this path of tightening monetary policy. So we'll probably see, I would say, between 4 to 6 more interest rate hikes from now until the end of the year. And certainly the war in Ukraine, the more lockdowns in China will continue to add volatility to the market. And it's something that we're seeing even today. By last count, in China, about a quarter of the population is under full or partial lockdown. So that will have really some dramatic effects on supply chain. So even for us, buying a dishwasher or getting a car, all of those things will be very difficult in the next 6 to 9 months, and therefore that will affect profitability for a lot of companies. So let's segue and talk about some of our the investments and our initiatives from our last year. And as folks that have participated in this seminar, in this webinar, have known, we have 2 main investment vehicles. The Consolidated Trust Fund is our main diversified pool. And at the end of last year, the CTF was valued at about $1.4 billion. Our smaller SRI fund, which stands for the Socially Responsible Investment Fund, was valued at about $42.5 million at the end of last year. So I'll touch on the performance of both of these funds in a slide a little bit later. But I'd like to go over some of the work that we did in 2021. And as Kevin said earlier, 2021 was a very busy year. And so just some of the updates on the initiatives that we've been working on. First was around ESG. So most of you all probably are already aware that ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And the investment team started a very comprehensive ESG survey of our investment managers. We evaluated each of our managers and how they're embedding ESG into their analysis, their proxy voting, the reporting, even their staffing. And we ranked each of our managers based on the level of ESG integration. We were actually quite pleased coming out of the survey to find that over half of our managers are actually doing a lot of work in this area. So we would rank them as very high in the survey when it comes to ESG integration. About 25% of our managers were what we consider average. So they're not doing any more, or they're not doing any less than their peers. And there are 2 or 3 managers that we ranked as what we call developing. So they are slightly behind their peer group. So through this annual or biannual evaluation, we're hoping to share best practices and encourage our managers to put more resources and thinking behind their ESG efforts. We also conducted our first carbon footprint audit in 2021 using MSCI's carbon analytics. It's the old saying that goes, you can't manage what you don't measure. So a gauge of our portfolio carbon intensity allows us to establish a baseline to work from. And going forward, this will also become a decision factor when we're evaluating managers or when we're looking at new mandates. Last year, we also signed on as members of the Responsible Investment Association, and we became a signatory for the RIA's Statement on Diversity and Inclusion, which is something that we are pushing for in all of our managers and all of our service providers. And with the approval of Vancouver Foundation's Board of Directors, we're also very happy to report that we partnered with SHARE, which stands for the Shareholder Association for Research and Education. SHARE represents more than $90 billion of institutional assets, and they are going to help us with advocacy and engagement to push for more sustainable business practices within our portfolio investments. And also really, as what you've heard from Jessica earlier, just drawing that link between reconciliation and responsible investments. So for example, one thing that SHARE would do is that they would push companies to opt for, to have free, prior and informed consent from Indigenous communities before they start engaging in development on their land. And lastly, we're doing quite a bit on impact investing. So these are investments that are made with the intention to generate positive and measurable social and environmental impact, in addition to earning a positive financial return. We're hard at work on a new impact investment fund, which we hope to roll out towards the second half of this year. So we switch gears and look at the investment performance for each of our two funds. Investors in general have had a phenomenal year in 2021, and the CTF was no exception. The fund gained 13.1% before fees in the last year, and the recent string of strong annual returns has pulled the long run average, as you can see in the 10-year annualized column. The 10-year annualized number is now at 9.9% before fees, so close to 10%, which is easily outperforming our long-term return objective of inflation plus 3.5%. And as mentioned earlier, worries around inflation, the war in Ukraine, the worsening supply chain disruptions has led to very volatile markets. And as a result, in the first 3 months of this year, this fund has given back some of those gains. This next page shows the diversification of our consolidated trust fund. Not too many changes were made in 2021. However, the investment committee took an in-depth look at our Canadian equity allocation over the last 6 months, which resulted in some changes towards since the beginning of this year. So we've added 2 new managers in the small cap Canadian equity space, which one is called Pembroke and one is called Connor Clark and Lung. As we've presented in prior years, our portfolio continues to be very well diversified by asset class, by geography, by currency, by manager, and even by investment styles. One common question that we've been fielding is, what is our Russian exposure within our investment portfolio? If you look on the right-hand side, those are all of our equity managers. We don't have any direct Russian equity holdings within our equity portfolio. However, we do have some modest exposure in our fixed income portfolio in the form of currency and bonds. So in total, less than $3.5 million at the end of December. Which is approximately 25 basis points of the whole portfolio. What we're trying to do is we've been in close contact with each of our managers who have told us that, one, they will not be adding to the Russian exposure and are actively looking eventually to divest all Russian holdings. Another one of our managers is also looking into how they can use portfolios and investing in bonds in terms of the reconstruction of the eventual reconstruction of Ukraine. So that's a quick overview of our CTF portfolio. Turning our attention to the Socially Responsible Investment Fund, or the SRI, here's the same asset mix pie chart. It's a smaller fund and therefore less diversified. One thing I did want to point out is how much the SRI has grown over the last 4 years. When we made the change to a fossil-free mandate, the fund was at about $12 million. The combination of more donor interest, stronger performance has allowed this fund to grow significantly over a short period of time. Recently, we've also made the SRI the default vehicle for donations such as estate gifts to Vancouver Foundation that don't specify a particular investment stream. So our goal is to continue to build the SRI fund to a size that will allow us to add more diversified strategies into the asset mix. So maybe I'll ask Mandy to cue the next polling question. So I'd like to say, if the SRI fund strategy is something that appeals to you or your organization, please speak with one of our donor services representatives or send a message through Zoom. And we're happy to provide more information and even facilitate a one-time stream switch. I'm just going to close that on my screen. So next, looking at performance of the SRI fund. The SRI fund gained 14% last year, so even higher than the CTF, and which takes the long-term 10-year annualized returns before fees to 9.7%, so just 0.2% shy of the CTF's 9.9% return. Why we're always talking about diversification and wanting to add more diversified strategies to the SRI is especially during times of significant market volatility, such as what we're experiencing right now, and also in the last couple of months. Diversification really does provide a much needed buffer to ensure returns are more stable. As you can see from the returns in the first 3 months of this year, the more concentrated SRI portfolio is down about 9%, and so which has captured a lot more of that downside than the CTF. One chart that we've consistently shown over the past 5 years of doing this presentation is the historical annual returns of our fund since the mid-1990s. And this year, alongside the blue bars, which show the CTF returns, which we've put into the SR, with the CTF blue bars, we've also put in the SRI returns, which are in green. And so every year, again, I sound a bit like a broken record, but this page really is a reminder that markets do go down and will go down. And as you can see in 2021, 2022, during that dot-com bust cycle, 2008 during the great financial crisis, and also year to date, we're seeing a lot of volatility in that very last column, which shows the year to date returns. And also, it's also when we compare the CTF and the SRI returns, we can clearly see that the SRI has outperformed from 2019 to 2021, largely due to the weakness of the commodity cycle. Commodity prices were low, and because the SRI fund isn't able to invest in, or it negatively screens out these carbon-intensive industries, it actually benefited. But in an inflationary, commodity-driven market such as the one that we're seeing right now, we do expect the SRI to underperform the more diversified CTF, especially in areas such as when we have real estate and multi-strategy funds within the CTF, that those asset classes really do provide a lot of dampening when it comes to lowering volatility. A reminder to everyone on the next slide in terms of how we derive our distribution formula. So we've historically used what we call a hybrid formula, or internally we call that the Yale Formula because it's modeled after the Yale Endowment. We use the Yale Formula to derive our DQ, or distribution quota. As you can see from the left-hand side of this page, the formula is made up of 2 parts. So 70% of the dollar distributions from last year plus inflation, and the other 30% is based on our target distribution rate of 4%. Our finance team did a lot of great work last year to model our ongoing distribution cushion. And due to many years of strong capital market returns, we were able to enhance our distribution quota by an extra 0.6%. We call this enhancement the community response recovery benefit. It essentially frees up additional granting income, which is much needed in the community without jeopardizing our long-term sustainability. It's also important to note that despite the recent market downturn, even newly established funds at Vancouver Foundation can make these additional grants because they are part of a larger pool, and the distribution cushion is shared universally with all funds. And finally, this last slide shows the distribution as a percentage of our 2 pools over the last 5 years. For 2022, the distribution quota is 4.37% for the CTF and 4.25% for the SRI. As you're aware, the latest federal budget has increased the minimum distribution quota for charities from 3.5% to 5%. As a result, our DQ will increase to at least 5% for next year. And as Don had mentioned earlier, an extensive study is currently underway to look at our asset mix and distribution formula based on these new DQ requirements. So that brings me to the end of this part of the presentation. And as always, if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat, or please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of our donor services team members. And with that, I will hand the next portion back to Kevin.
Thanks, David, Don, and Eugene. Fantastic set of information there. And the foundation essentially has on one level, a fairly simple business model. We have money given to us by many generous donors. That money's invested, and as you heard from Eugene, invested in ways that we're increasingly trying to align with our vision and our purpose. And that money invested generates granting dollars that you've heard some of the examples today of how that the proceeds of the work that David, Don, and Eugene, and Adrian and Bonnie undertake. And so we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the kind of the third part of that process. We've talked about money in, we've talked about money invested. We want to talk about money granted, and spend some time with a theme that has been increasingly important to us, and it is working with Liban Abukar, who's going to join me on screen in a few moments, talking about the Foundation for Black Communities, an idea that I think when I think of my conversations with Liban over the last couple of years, I often put them in the context of, when I look back at this time period, I think this will be a turning point. This will be a moment when philanthropy has realized both its strengths and its shortcomings. And then thanks to people like Liban and his colleagues and many people on this call have taken concrete action to address our industry, our sector, to make it better. And so Liban and I are going to have a conversation about the Foundation for Black Communities and some of the work that he's been doing. But I want to set it up very briefly with just a kind of characterization of the relationship that Liban and I have. We met, like many people over the last 2 years, on the phone and on Zoom, and had some really, really fascinating conversations about the work that he's doing. And when we finally had a chance to meet in person a few months ago, we met on the top floor of the library. And for most of the better part of 2 years, we've been talking about work and the challenges our society is facing and the things that we're doing to try and overcome them. And the first thing that Liban said when he met me was, "Today, Kevin, we're not going to talk about work. We're going to talk about each other. We're going to talk about our relationship. Who are we? Where do we come from? What are our families? What motivates us?" And that was, like many things in my relationship with Liban, that was inspiring. And it was a conversation to say, we've spent lots of time about work. We're going to have lots of time to talk about work in the future. Let's just get to know each other in person. And it was a lovely conversation. I really want to thank Liban for highlighting the fact that it's a relationship that we're in. And that relationship is strengthened by getting to know each other and learning a bit about each other. So what I want to do is, in the spirit of relationship building that I've enjoyed with Liban, is extend that to this group. That we'll talk a little bit about who we are, where we come from, and we will talk a bit about work, because that again, we've got to make some progress here. So I just would welcome Liban Abukar. As I mentioned, I got to know him a couple of years ago. Liban, do you want to just say a few words about yourself? I'll let you use the words you want to use to introduce yourself.
Yeah, first and foremost, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank Kevin and Mandy and Craig and everyone else at Vancouver Foundation who thought this would be a really good opportunity, not only for us to share a bit of the work that we're doing at the Foundation for Black Communities, but more important than that, I think, demonstrate exactly what you just spoke about, the relationship that we're building with Vancouver Foundation, because it's a really important one, Kevin. Whether or not you folks will recognize it or we'll put your humility aside for a moment and allow yourselves the credit. Vancouver Foundation has been driving the landscape of Canadian philanthropy and will continue to do so. And so it's really important that we mark the support, the partnership, the relationships that are being built here. So a little bit about me for those of you who haven't had the chance to meet. I'm a big fan of cardigans. So if you see me in the future, you'll likely see that I'm wearing a cardigan. I'm one of 9. My name is Liban Fadah Abukar. My name matters to me. It tells you who I am, because Liban is my first name, Fadah is my father, so it tells you I'm the son of Fadah, who was the son of Abukar. Again, the root of the conversation I'll have today is relationships, and more importantly, relationships. Why understanding each other more intimately rather than looking at each other as others is so important, because I can't get you to care about the things I care about if you don't care about me or if you don't understand who I am. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I think that'll probably reveal far more about the things I care about and who I am, rather than a top line explanation of my bio. But briefly, I'll share. I come as somebody who's sat on and who's been involved in the philanthropic sector for a number of years. I'll share that in a bit of my story. I'm currently the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Youth Leaps of Toronto. Our main focus is on supporting the education, attainment, and employment labor market access for Black youth in Toronto. And again, that location of someone who's a grant seeker working with a very particular equity deserving, equity seeking group informs much of my work and why the Foundation for Black Communities both emerges and is such an important new entrance into the Canadian philanthropic landscape.
Liban, so that's a great starting point, because you mentioned working for Youth Leaps, an organization that was a grant seeker and delivering some really important programs in your community. And so I'm just wondering, what was the leap, so to speak, from working on the grant seeking side to saying, you know, what this ecosystem needs is another foundation, and a foundation that is called the Foundation for Black Communities. What was, talk to me a little bit about what brought you to that point to say that, because with thousands of foundations in Canada, what was the particular drive to say there's a space here, there's an opportunity for innovation and creation, and I'm going to jump into it?
So in order to start, I have to go back to 1999. So in 1999, 2000, I get my first job. I'm making $7.25 in Toronto, and I'm working at a place called Central Neighborhood House. It's a very small community center in downtown Toronto, on the east side of downtown, the part of downtown that doesn't have Bay Street, the area that is surrounded by, I think, about 4 or 5 of the largest men's shelters, women's shelters, and shelters in the city. We're bordered by Sherbourne and Shooter, for those of you who are maybe familiar with Toronto, which is a corridor of Toronto that has the highest police incidents, meaning from an activity standpoint, the number of phone calls to police come from that corridor. This is where I live. I had a church and a police station in my neighborhood. Like it was designed in a way. It was, Regent Park was built in 1945, 1946 for Jewish immigrants post World War II, but it soon becomes home to various different other communities, immigrants from Southeast Asia, economic immigrants from the Atlantic region, newcomers from Africa, and so many others, all sharing a very common experience, which is the sort of desire to get the Canadian dream, if you will, get access to opportunity. But the experience there was remarkably different than access to a dream. It was marked by increased experiences of violence, low income, education attainment rates and graduation rates were significantly lower than across the city and the province. So this is the neighborhood that I grew up in. I think it's important to sort of frame this, because the Central Neighborhood House where I get the job, it's this little slice of relief from that experience. It was where we could go and get access to a computer to do our homework. If folks remember, 1999, 2000, there just isn't a prevalence of laptops or computers. Internet is something that people can access, but it's still very much dial-up. For those of you who remember MSN Messenger, if someone's on the phone, you're really not getting, you can't do your homework. So it was a place where we needed to go to get our homework done. It was a place where we got sports programs. There was a hot kitchen for food. It was one of the very few programs that had a young girls program. At that time, it was just sort of dropped, and it still wasn't considered, normal to have, a young women's program and a young men's program in that community. So it was this really safe space that provided me, anyway, hot lunches, sports, friendships, and then ultimately employment. A few years go by, and I transition out of employment, and someone gives me a call and says, "Liban, we're looking for a board director. We have a youth role that we're looking to fill. Would you be interested in that board role?" And I said, "Sure. I don't really know what a board is. I'm not sure how I'm going to help here, but sure, let me get in." And I joined, and one of the first things that I was given was our budget. And I read how much money each program cost. But what really struck me was the next page, which was all the programs we were going to have to cut because funding wasn't coming to those programs. So all the programs I just described to you that I benefited from were on the chopping block, precarious. And that struck me. That was, I had no idea how these things worked. I just knew that I benefited from them. And I know that I needed them. And yet here I am, I think about 17, 18 years old, having to be on a board to, they peel back the curtain, and I'm about to see just how precarious supports that my community gets is. And that was my aha moment. And I remember asking, so why don't we just ask them for more money? And that's when I learned about grant opportunities, one-time grant making, how grant making can't support staffing. It doesn't support operations. It's only restricted to this. And my mind was blown. The impact was clear. The benefit was there. Yet I could not understand why there wasn't support for this kind of work. And so that was my first that was my entrance into the nonprofit, charitable, philanthropic space, Kevin. Sorry for the lengthiness, but I think it's really important to sort of share that entry point and what drives me since. I remember walking home later that night, following that board meeting, thinking to myself, I'm en route to graduate. And at that point, I don't think I would have graduated without the homework program that I mentioned, without the access to the computer. That just wouldn't have happened. And now I'm thinking to myself, how on earth are the kids who are my age or the ones younger than me, how are they going to graduate? What is a job they're going to have if they can't work at a camp that's no longer around? The computer program that no one can staff anymore, the food program that no one can get access to. What on earth is this going to mean? I had no way to solve that problem. I ended up moving, forgetting completely about it because I'm 18 years old. I get a job in the Ministry of Health. I end up working in government, making a decent income. I end up going to work for a private equity company, making good money. And I cannot shake the fact that the community that gave me the service and supports that I benefited from, I've gone so far from it. And yet still those programs, since I was 18, are no longer around. And so that's where Youth Leaps comes from. And a desire to say, I have to figure out how to provide those supports into my community that I all had the chance to benefit from. It's this idea, Kevin, of putting something back into the pot that you benefited from. Not just taking and leaving, but making sure we give back. And when it came to Youth Leaps, I had an incredible opportunity. We had an idea, we had support, and we started with a $1.5 million contribution. Kevin, that's just astounding. I mean, $1.5 million unrestricted to do whatever we wanted with. That lasted us 10 years. From 2009 to 2019, we had $1.95 million. And I remember saying to our funder, not only are we going to solve the issue of education attainment, we're going to bring you back some change. I was so confident that 1.5 million was going to change everything. And, of course it didn't, but what it did was it provided us 10 years of consistent program permanence, if you will. Our community could predictably know that a kid who started from kindergarten to grade 10 would have access to homework programs, tutoring, relationships. We help folks with graduation, throwing graduation parties, getting access to post-secondary, and so much more. And then 2019 hit. That $1.5 million ran out. We had no idea that pandemic was on the route. I know this is a really long story, sorry. And here I was looking and thinking to myself, shoot, I have something to decide. Either I can shut the organization down or I can continue to go fundraise. But I remember looking around thinking, maybe shutting the organization down is the best thing. Maybe we take all of our existing programs, our best practices, and we're going to give it to another organization that has the ability to be sustained. And then I started looking around, and here's something I didn't realize. Over that 10-year period, all the Black-led organizations that I had been working with, that I needed as partners, had been shutting their doors. And because I was okay, I didn't take stock of this. So by the time that Youth Leaps runs out, there's no partners to take on the work that we were doing. And at that point, I realized it made no sense to keep Youth Leaps alive all by itself, because my homework club depends on the food program. that sports program, the housing program, the legal services program, the mental health program. It required an ecosystem of partners to ensure that the young person who accessed my homework club could actually have the enabling environment to succeed. Because the fundamental truth is no one program or no one organization is going to solve the multitude of issues that any one human being has, young, old, senior, child. So it was at that point we recognized that saving Youth Leaps would be futile. We could have done that. I could have called a few funders and said, I need a couple of grants and saved us, but it would have been futile, which is why we started thinking about a more systems level approach. How do we ensure that all the Black-led organizations that were serving my community could survive so that the work of Youth Leaps could actually have the impact that it can, because a homework club alone, food program alone, housing program alone cannot, it can't change things. And so that's where the Foundation for Black Communities stemmed from. Because when I went out there and spoke to the executive directors of those organizations, Kevin, and I asked them, why did you out of business? Initially, my thoughts were just bad programs, poor management, not the right staff. But that wasn't the case. They showed us that they were running on fumes and passion for years. And at some point, they just couldn't do it anymore. You can only work as a volunteer. You can only work at subpar income for so long. And so at that point, we recognized that we had to figure out a solution to this. And if folks weren't going to fund this work, we would have to figure out how to do it ourselves. At that point, it was no longer about asking a seat at the table. It was building our own damn table. And that's what the Foundation for Black Communities it intends to do, ensure that Black-led communities have the services and supports that they need to ensure that they can overcome the issues that are often been wicked, long-standing, and entrenched. And that's not to speak about the pandemic and what those experiences have been.
That's a very compelling origin story. Speaking of essential programs that to survive depend on reliable money and unrestricted money, and the absence of that inspired you. And so what I want to talk a little bit more about is, so you're working to create this, what I often refer to as an identity-based foundation. It's Foundation for Black Communities. And there are many other foundations around that are identity-based. We have the Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver here. We've got the Canadian Women's Foundation, and we have many place-based institutions. There's 191 community foundations. There's over 50 in BC. There's over 50 in Ontario. You have the neighborhood houses that are place-based. Can you talk a little bit about how you see these organizations working effectively together? Because one of the conversations is, well, does the existence of one let somebody else off the hook? Because you also have experience-based foundations, which are often coming out of perhaps a health, like a cancer or a heart and stroke. So we have all of these different kinds of organizations that have a focus, a place, an experience, an identity. How do you see them working well together, and do they in fact let each other off the hook if they so choose?
Not at all. So it goes back to my experience at Youth Leaps. I ran a very specific initiative. We had a very specific mandate. We wanted to help kids graduate high school, get into university, and get jobs. But I could not do that without the organization that provided housing support, like I mentioned, or the organization that provided language supports to seniors, or the legal services, or there's so many more. To me, I see an ecosystem that requires place-based community foundations like a Vancouver Foundation, working alongside identity-based organizations like Canadian Women Foundations, or the Indigenous Peoples Resiliency Funds, or the Jewish or community foundations, and FFBC. To us, I think we need to, I know this sounds almost inherently and antithetical to the very premise of a community foundation, but I don't think we can only think about our own backyards. There are some issues like gender equity, environmental justice, and social and racial justice that require us to take a more uniform approach. Not a uniform, but a universal sort of mindset, thinking about the collective beyond our own backyards. And I think that works really well. For example, I think community foundations have an incredibly clear understanding of what Black communities need in your neighborhood. Because frankly, employment needs in Vancouver aren't the exact same in Nova Scotia. But there are some common issues. For example, criminalization. housing and access to housing, food, right? And, economic justice. There, at some point, those issues can also have, I think, a more common experience or common requirement for solution making. So I don't see the Foundation for Black Communities being able to exist on its own. It cannot be the thing that provides people abdication from their responsibility. It shall not and will not. We need that I think that 40,000 foot view, that 10,000 foot view, if you will, that street sort of work where I think community foundations do so well. And I think we need that organizing support that a community foundation like a national foundation can offer, especially when it comes to thinking about policy issues. I don't think a community foundation alone in Toronto is going to deal with a key advocacy problem like national housing for Black folks. That just isn't something that is in your purview you can do alone. And so I think that's where the cooperation works, not to mention scale. I want to be clear. The Foundation for Black Communities is looking to raise a $300 million endowment. At 5% disbursement, we're talking about 15 million nationally. That's a lot more than we get now. For those of you who are familiar with the Unfunded Report that I co-authored and that was published by Carleton University, it showed that for every $100 Canadian foundations currently give out, which includes community foundations, only 7 cents out of $100 goes out. 7 cents, right? And so to me, that $15 million isn't earth-shattering, but it means that it's a consistent base, a durable, predictable base to sustain our programs, which then can be supplemented by the incredible efforts of community foundations like Vancouver, like your Level program, which I commend you on, and others that are being built. So to us, it's not an exclusive, it's not an either or, they have to work together, which is why I love the phrasing you've always said, FFBCs of the world only enrich our system. They don't take anything away.
Yeah, thanks, Liban. And I was going to mention the unfunded report because I think that's one of the key ways that identity-based foundations, as an example, can really challenge place-based and others to say, you've got a blind spot here. You may not have realized it, but the unfunded report shows quite clearly that foundations like Vancouver Foundation have a blind spot. So it's that research and those conversations and can tell us, and this is, I think, something that really landed with us as a community foundation that really strives to be community inspired, to be community directed. Yeah, your research showed that there were members of our community that we weren't listening to, that we weren't funding. And so that's been a challenge and a welcome challenge for us to do better. And I think it's one good example of how the existence of a champion organization like Foundation for Black Communities can work with a place-based organization and say, hey, we actually have some shared interests and we can lift each other up to better address them. So I wanted to certainly highlight the unfunded report as well. And I also like your comment about the, linking the local to the national, because that's also a good point that place-based community foundations, unless they're connected to some national conversations, are not learning what they can do, nor are they contributing what they're knowing to that ecosystem. So it's another way that mosaic gets built. So I've been, so I see those benefits, and I appreciate the calls to action that have come my way from you and your colleagues. And you also touched on something that you won't need to convince many people on this call about the importance of endowments. But I did want to ask you a little bit about how you balance, and you've talked eloquently about the importance for stable and consistent funding to keep the infrastructure alive. But how do you balance the demands for spending today? And that's one of the big conversations that's been driving public policy in Canada around endowments, is how they're balancing retained earnings. And we just saw recently in this presentation that the Vancouver Foundation has earned returns, significant returns over the last decade. And we're trying to balance that earning of what we've earned today with what we're spending today and what we're spending tomorrow. So, they're really the simple question out of all that is, how do you balance an endowment in a way that you're confident that you're spending enough today versus saving enough for tomorrow in the face of very real and pressing demands from constituents today?
Kevin, so I'm going to answer this question. I want to pivot back for a moment. that's the answer lies in the answer I just gave him a few moments ago. Collaboration between national foundations like FFBC, the Foundation for Black Communities, and local community foundations that are place-based is that answer. The reason why we can't let folks off the hook is because the Foundation for Black Communities is never going to be able to support all Black communities everywhere all the time. We need to figure out how to get others also investing, right? So how do we get the Vancouver foundations to increase their investments, the Calgary foundations, the Toronto foundations, private foundations, corporations? That aggregate, right, I think offsets any challenge where someone says, what about the urgency of now, right? And we've seen that. I think it's happening now. So I want to commend again the Level program as a response to that, right? And so I think that's one of the ways that we're comfortable having an endowment, knowing that we're responding to the urgency of now, while still thinking about very diligently and carefully about the needs of tomorrow. It's not about spending only the dollars that FFBC has, but it's about growing the pie large enough that the needs of today are being met through the various different actors and players that we're inviting into the space of thinking about Black folks. We don't want Black communities to only be a concerned constituency, a constituency of concern only for us. We want Black communities to be a concerned constituency or a key constituency for all foundations. So that's one of the ways that I think we're going to resolve the tension of the now versus the need of tomorrow. That's number one. Number two, I want to talk about the circumstances that led to this vision being realized. It took the spectacle of a murder of George Floyd. It took years and years and years of experiencing protests. It took a very particular climate and condition to create the impetus, the resolve, the willingness for these kind of conversations to emerge. And I pray to God that that will never happen again. But here's what will happen again, predictably. A new issue will come up, which will sideline Black communities as a priority. We've had the pandemic. We now have Ukraine. We'll have global economic or macro global economic issues like recessions. We had the Indigenous issues that should, I don't know, if Indigenous issues fall off the table for us as Canadians, I don't think, like, I mean, what else won't fall? We have the environment. So we have so many things that'll take the focus away from Black communities that we have to ensure that there will be at least one entity that always has Black communities as a key priority. And that has to be something that we have that has some permanence, which is why an endowment is so necessary. But that I hope I answers your question, Kevin, of how we resolve that tension. It's not only about how much we give, it's about inviting more to the table, inviting more people to see Black communities as a key constituency, because we know that changing winds always turn blind eyes to Black communities. And the endowment is the one way we're going to ensure that when those blind eyes that will surely occur, those blind spots occur, our community is not wholly forgotten.
That's great, Liban. And then the last couple of minutes, I do want to talk about fundraising, because you've identified $300 million as the target for the foundation. I've had great indications of support from the federal government towards a $200 million contribution. And you've challenged Philanthropy, including Vancouver Foundation, to raise $100 million to support the foundation. We've provided some modest support so far. We would very much like to, as Vancouver Foundation, to
instrumental.
Thank you. Yeah, instrumental, but still modest. And so we would like to continue to support you with eventually a substantial gift. But can you just talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities you see in fundraising that to get the foundation to the $300 million mark?
Kevin, I don't see a challenge besides willingness, to be honest.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about an industry that has $100 billion under assets managed. We're looking to raise $100 million. We've challenged every single community foundation, public foundation, private foundation, and corporate foundation to contribute 3.5% of their assets under management to FFBC. The returns that we just saw, within a couple of quarters, most foundations would make up that given. And it could be done over a few years. So that's our ask. However, we've seen that can be some challenging to some folks. So what we now have is, and I hope I can announce it, working with Vancouver Foundation and others, is we're putting together a capital campaign to raise that additional $100 million. So we invite everyone to please join, consider the contribution they can make. it's really simple. We have our link. I'll make sure that Mandy probably can share it later. You can go on there and make a contribution directly. You can reach out directly to FFBC, speak to Liban. My contact information is with Kevin. We can talk about what a gift can look like. And honestly, the contribution size isn't as important as it is to demonstrate the real willingness to work with Black communities. And if I have a minute, I want to quickly share a story, Kevin, from Kenny, which is, I think, so that I once heard from Kenny. There was a group of students that went to Kenya, and they were doing a research project. They had about 3 weeks. They were there for about 3 weeks, and while they were there, they were fed, housed, and befriended by this community. Right before they left, they wanted to thank the community and say, hey, like, you guys really took care of us. What can we do for you as a go-away present? They started to notice that every morning, the women would get up at 4 or 5 a.m. and walk about 3 to 4 kilometers to fetch water. And they said, brilliant idea. We're going to make sure that women don't have to do this anymore. We're going to build them a well. So right before they left, they built them a well. The community thanked them. They left. About a year later, the students graduated, and as they thought, well, how great would it be to return to the community that we were once living with, just to say thank you, because we wouldn't have graduated without this project. They all fly back, and that the day they return, naturally they go look at the well, and it's filled with garbage. Some of them are fuming, some of them are perplexed. And later that night during dinner, one of them stands up and goes, hey, like, just a quick question. We're students, we didn't have a lot of money. We spent whatever little that we had to build you the well, and here we come back to see it filled with complete garbage. What gives? There's an incredible awkward silence, Kevin. Everyone's looking around. Then one of the elders stands up and says, first of all, thank you. The intent of your gift was never forgotten, and we've always appreciated it. However, had you asked us, you would have known that we didn't need a well, that there's a innate reason behind the reason that women walk in the morning to get water. For example, it allows the women who are elders to take the younger women and have conversations about life, child raising, community, business. It also lets the men who are often in the field working spend some time during the day with their children to impart lessons, language, so forth. And then another one, and all of a sudden it hits you and it says, there's inherent wisdom, knowledge, and experience that communities have about what they need. It's never appropriate to decide for them. Never. And so I share that story to say, this is what the reason of a foundation for Black communities. A Vancouver foundation should always exist, and so should others, but they should never be the ones to decide what investments we make in our own solution making. That's our job. That's our responsibility. It should be us to determine our futures and our solution making. So when you talk about how can folks fundraise, if you believe in the fundamental right of folks being able to decide on what's good for themselves and appreciate that self-autonomy, that self-determination, then I hope that you not only contribute financially, but also you champion the cause of the Foundation for Black Communities in the same way that I hope that folks are championing the Indigenous Peoples Resiliency Fund and other identity-based organizations that the foundations that will exist. For example, I know there's one for LGBT communities that folks are working on. So I thank you for your time, Kevin, and I hope that story that I shared really captures why a foundation that's identity-based is needed, but it doesn't take away from the incredible work that community foundations do, and I hope will continue to.
Thank you very much, Liban. As always, really enjoyed our conversation. I hope the audience also has enjoyed it as well. We have put the links in the chat. Again, this brings us to the end of our annual update for our donors and partners. And I want to thank everyone who participated today. There will be a survey coming to you by email afterwards for some feedback on the event for everyone who's here. And as we mentioned at the beginning, a recording made available. So thanks, everyone, and I'll wish you all the best for the upcoming day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.